What if I told you there's an encounter between two men who played Jesus Christ, an encounter so intense, so profound, that one of them simply couldn't bear the emotional weight of what he heard? Jim Caviezel, the man who gave his body and soul to portray Christ in The Passion of the Christ, and Jonathan Roumie, the actor who won millions of hearts as the Jesus of The Chosen, finally met. And what happened between them wasn't a simple conversation between professional colleagues. It was something much deeper, something that touched open wounds, memories that Jim had tried to bury for 2 decades, and truths he never imagined hearing from another human being. This video reveals what really happened when these two men looked into each other's eyes, and why Jim Caviezel couldn't handle what Jonathan Roumie told him. If you seek to understand the mysteries that happen when God places specific people in our paths, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Your participation makes all the difference. Few know this, but Jim Caviezel and Jonathan Roumie traveled extraordinarily similar spiritual paths before even meeting in person. Both are devout Catholics, and both paid extremely high prices for their choices to portray the Son of God on screen. When Jim accepted the role in The Passion of the Christ in 2004, Mel Gibson clearly warned him, "If you do this, you'll never work in this town again." And Jim, without hesitation, replied that we all need to embrace our crosses. He didn't know those words would become prophetic in a way he could never have imagined. During filming in Italy, Jim was struck by lightning while on the cross. Yes, you heard that correctly. A bolt of lightning hit him directly during a scene. And it wasn't just once that the sky seemed to unleash its fury on that set. The assistant director was also struck, twice, at the same filming location. Jim suffered severe hypothermia, dislocated his shoulder carrying the heavy wooden cross, received a real whiplash that left a 14-inch scar on his back, and the physical and emotional stress eventually led him to 2 heart surgeries, including open heart surgery. Some of the screams you hear in the film aren't acting. They're the real pain of a man being literally crucified for his art and his faith. And what happened afterward? Hollywood turned its back on Jim Caviezel. Suddenly, the actor who was at his peak, who had shined in films like The Count of Monte Cristo, Angel Eyes with Jennifer Lopez, and The Thin Red Line, simply stopped receiving calls. The invitations dried up, the doors closed. In an interview years later, Jim admitted with cutting clarity, "Suddenly, I went from being one of the top 5 actors at the studio, and I hadn't done anything wrong. I just played Jesus." The entertainment industry, that same industry that celebrates freedom of expression and diversity, silently placed Jim Caviezel on an invisible blacklist. And he carried that cross in silence for years. Jonathan Roumie knew this story. He knew every detail, every sacrifice, every visible and invisible scar that Jim carried. Before accepting the role of Jesus in The Chosen, Jonathan spent 8 years in Los Angeles struggling to get small parts, accumulating debts, questioning whether he would ever be able to live from his art. When Dallas Jenkins chose him to play Christ in the series that would be crowdfunded, Jonathan knew exactly what risk he was taking. He had seen what had happened to Jim. And yet, he said yes, because, as he himself declared in interviews, "If it weren't for my faith, I wouldn't be here." What many don't know is that the 2 actors began working together on the Catholic prayer app Hallow, guiding meditations on The Imitation of Christ by Thomas A. Kempis. Every Monday and Wednesday during Lent, their voices joined to lead millions of faithful in profound spiritual reflections. But those recordings were made separately, until finally, at an event that few witnessed, Jim Caviezel and Jonathan Roumie met in person. And it was at that moment that something extraordinary happened. According to sources close to both actors, Jonathan looked into Jim's eyes and spoke words that echoed like thunder in the veteran's heart. Jonathan spoke about the weight of playing Jesus, about the crushing responsibility of representing the supreme model of humanity, about how people confuse him with his character and expect him to heal them. On one occasion, a mother approached Jonathan with her son in a wheelchair, paralyzed from the neck down, hoping that the man who plays Jesus on television could perform a miracle. Her favorite scene from the series was precisely the one where Jesus heals a paralytic. And Jonathan had to look into that mother's eyes and tell her the hardest truth. I'm not the real Jesus. I'm just an actor. Sometimes we wonder what exists beyond our physical world, and other times strange things happen that make us question everything we thought about life. In such situations, a better understanding can mean the difference between being confused and having clarity. That's exactly what our ebook, The Secret of Jesus' Apparitions, offers. Consider acquiring this incredible material for a symbolic value. This exclusive material offers keys to decipher divine signs and understand how Christ manifests in our days. Your contribution allows us to maintain this independent research work. The link to acquire the material is available in the pinned comment. When Jonathan shared this experience with Jim, something broke inside the man who had been literally crucified for his role 20 years earlier. Jim knew that weight. He knew that impossible responsibility. He knew the pain of carrying the expectations of millions of people who see in you not an actor, but a channel for the divine. And when Jonathan finally said the words Jim had waited to hear for 2 decades, words of recognition, of understanding, of spiritual brotherhood, Jim couldn't contain himself. Witnesses report that Jim became visibly emotional. Some say he needed to step away for a moment. Others claim that tears ran down the face of the man who had endured lightning strikes, whippings, hypothermia, and Hollywood's ostracism without ever showing weakness publicly. Because Jonathan Roumie didn't just understand Jim's sacrifice, he validated it. He acknowledged that the price paid wasn't in vain. And for a man who spent 20 years being silently punished for his faith, hearing those words from another soldier in the same battle was simply too much to bear. But what exactly did Jonathan say to Jim? What were the specific words that broke the defenses of one of Hollywood's most resilient actors? And why did this meeting happen right now, when monumental changes are occurring in the world of Christian cinema? The answer involves secrets that are only now being revealed, 2 decades after The Passion of the Christ changed movie history forever. And to understand the depth of that moment, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to understand what really happened during those filmings in Italy, and why so many people who were on that set still refuse to talk about what they saw. The filming location in Matera, Italy, was never an ordinary place. From the first day, something different hung in the air. Members of the technical crew, extras, production assistants, everyone felt a presence they couldn't explain. It wasn't something visible, but it was palpable. An energy that made the hairs on their arms stand up, that provoked spontaneous tears during rehearsals, that transformed confessed atheists into men on their knees, asking for forgiveness. Luca Lionello, the actor who played Judas, entered the set as a declared atheist. He left converted to Christianity, and he wasn't the only one. Mel Gibson had invested $30 million from his own pocket in this project. Hollywood had unanimously rejected the idea. A film spoken entirely in Aramaic, Latin, and Hebrew, without known stars, without commercial concessions, portraying the brutal death of Jesus Christ with never-before-seen realism. The executives laughed. They said no one would watch it, but Mel wasn't making a film to please executives. He was fulfilling a mission. In his own words, he was a terrible man, a sinner, and it was his sins that first nailed Christ to the cross. So he wanted to tell this story the way it really happened. The decision to film in Matera wasn't accidental. The city, carved in rock, seemed to have been frozen in time since the days of Christ. Its stone streets, its caves inhabited for millennia, Its arid and biblical landscape created the perfect atmosphere to transport viewers back to first-century Jerusalem. Mel built a full-scale Golgotha on the outskirts of the city. Authentic wooden crosses, ancient tools, paths of packed earth, no plastic, no digital sets, no shortcuts. And it was precisely that authenticity that seemed to attract something more to that place. The weather in Matera during filming behaved in ways that defied any meteorological explanation. Sunny mornings transformed into black skies in a matter of minutes. Violent winds appeared out of nowhere, knocking down equipment, ripping tents from the ground. Sandstorms appeared without warning and disappeared just as quickly. At certain moments, it seemed like nature itself was reacting to what was being filmed. And then came the lightning. Jim Caviezel was on the cross, in position, covered in makeup simulating blood and wounds, when the first lightning bolt struck. The impact was direct. The electrical discharge coursed through his body, throwing him backward, making him bite his own tongue and cheeks. The crew froze in shock. No one could believe what had just happened. And while they were still trying to process what occurred, another lightning bolt hit the same spot, this time striking Gian Michelini, the assistant director, who incredibly had already been struck earlier during filming. Twice. On the same set, in the same production. Scientists call this extremely rare. Those who were present called it something else. The accounts of what happened during certain specific scenes are even more disturbing. During the flagellation, crew members reported feeling sudden nausea, dizziness, a sensation of pressure in the chest that had no medical explanation. Some described sudden drops in temperature, as if the air around them had been sucked somewhere else. Others spoke of a presence, something watching, something too ancient and powerful to be named. Mel Gibson himself was seen walking away from the set during these scenes. Some say he was praying. Others claim he was crying. Perhaps he was doing both. Jim Caviezel paid with his body for every second of that performance. During the flagellation scene, the whips had been carefully designed not to hit his skin. But in one of the takes, the angle changed slightly, and one of the ends tore his back, leaving a 14-inch wound. Makeup artists later revealed they couldn't distinguish between the fake wounds and the real ones appearing on Jim's body. When he carried the heavy cross along the stone paths, his shoulder dislocated. Some of the screams you hear in the final film aren't acting. They're the genuine pain of a man being literally destroyed by his role. Jonathan Roumie knew every detail of these stories. Before accepting the role of Jesus in The Chosen, he obsessively studied everything related to the Passion of the Christ and the man who had given everything for that performance. Jonathan knew he was treading on sacred ground when he agreed to play Christ. He knew he was taking on a mantle that few men in cinema history had carried. And he knew, above all, that Jim Caviezel had paved that path with his own blood. What few realize is that Jonathan faced his own demons before finding his purpose. 8 years in Los Angeles, struggling to survive as an actor, accumulating debts, questioning whether God really had a plan for his life. He had small parts in independent Catholic films, played Jesus in Easter plays, but recognition never came. Until Dallas Jenkins found him. And when The Chosen exploded, reaching more than 280 million viewers worldwide, Jonathan finally understood why he had gone through those desert years. But fame brought with it a weight that Jonathan hadn't anticipated. People began confusing him with his character. At public events, faithful would kneel before him, asking for blessings. Mothers brought sick children, expecting miraculous healings. On one particularly painful occasion, a woman approached him with her paralyzed son in a wheelchair. She said their favorite scene from the series was the one where Jesus heals a paralytic. And then she looked into Jonathan's eyes with a hope that broke his heart. Jonathan had to explain, with all the gentleness he could muster, that he wasn't the real Jesus, that he couldn't heal anyone. that he was just a man playing the role of his life. When Jonathan finally met Jim Caviezel in person, he carried all these experiences with him. He carried the weight of millions of expectations, the crushing responsibility of representing the most important figure in human history, and the deep knowledge that the man before him had endured all of this first and had paid an even greater price. Jim Caviezel had been literally struck by lightning, whipped, symbolically crucified by the industry he loved, and yet he had never backed down. He had never denied his faith. He had never regretted his choice. The meeting between the two happened in a context few know about. Both were working on the Hallow app, guiding spiritual meditations for millions of Catholics around the world. Their voices joined virtually to lead the faithful through the Stations of the Cross, meditations on the 7 last words of Christ, spiritual exercises that transformed Lenten seasons into journeys of profound conversion. But until that moment, they had never met face to face. Close sources reveal that when Jonathan finally looked into Jim's eyes, something changed in the atmosphere. It was as if two souls who had traveled parallel paths finally recognized each other. Jonathan spoke about his own journey, about the years of struggle, and about the impossible weight of portraying the divine. And then he said something Jim never expected to hear, something that validated 2 decades of sacrifice, of ostracism, of carrying an invisible cross while Hollywood turned its back. What exactly were those words? And why did they have such a devastating impact on a man who had endured lightning, whippings, and the abandonment of an entire industry without ever showing weakness? The answer reveals not only the depth of the connection between these two men, but also secrets about what really happened during the filming of The Passion of the Christ that are only now being revealed. The words Jonathan Roumie said to Jim Caviezel at that meeting echoed like a silent earthquake in the soul of a man who had spent 2 decades carrying wounds no one could see. According to accounts from people close to both actors, Jonathan looked directly into Jim's eyes and said that he had been the pioneer, the first to clear the path, the man who had made it possible for other actors to play Christ without shame in an industry that openly despises faith. Jonathan acknowledged that without Jim's sacrifice in 2004, without his courage to face Hollywood head-on, without his willingness to lose everything for his conviction, series like The Chosen would never have existed. Jim Caviezel didn't just play Jesus. He lived the crucifixion in flesh and bone so that others could follow. For a man who spent 20 years being silently excluded, who watched his career mysteriously slow down after his most important role, who faced accusations and labels for simply defending his faith, hearing those words of recognition was simply devastating. Jim had endured literal lightning without shedding a tear in public. He had endured real whippings, hypothermia, heart surgeries, all without ever showing weakness. But hearing from another man who carried the same weight, who intimately understood the cost of portraying the divine, that his sacrifice had meant something, that his suffering had opened doors for a new generation of Christian art, that broke his defenses in a way no physical suffering ever could. Witnesses described that Jim remained silent for a long moment. His eyes, those same eyes that had looked through the camera with the intensity of Christ in Gethsemane, filled with tears. Some people present report that he needed to step away briefly, unable to maintain the composure he had cultivated for 2 decades. Others say he embraced Jonathan with a force that conveyed everything words couldn't express. What everyone agrees on is that something profound happened in that moment, something that transcended a simple conversation between professional colleagues. What makes this meeting even more significant is the context in which it occurred. While Jim and Jonathan were finally recognizing each other as brothers in a shared spiritual journey, monumental changes were happening behind the scenes in Hollywood. Mel Gibson, the man who had risked his fortune and reputation to create The Passion of the Christ, was finally preparing the long-awaited sequel. The resurrection of Christ had been announced, and filming was scheduled to begin at Cinecittà Studios in Rome, the same place where the magic and terror of the original film had been captured 2 decades earlier. Gibson spent years developing the script with his brother Donald and the Braveheart screenwriter Randall Wallace. There were at least 6 versions of the script, each more ambitious than the last. In recent interviews, Mel described the film as an acid trip, something he had never read before. The story wouldn't be linear. It would explore realms beyond the physical, from the fall of the angels to the death of the last apostle. To tell this story properly, Mel explained, it would be necessary to go to hell, to Sheol, to the places where the cosmic battle between good and evil unfolds outside human eyes. What few know is that Jonathan visited The Chosen set in Matera, the same Italian city where The Passion of the Christ was filmed 2 decades earlier. Walking those same stone streets, stepping on the same ground where Jim Caviezel had carried his cross, was an experience Jonathan described as profoundly spiritual. It was as if the ghosts of that earlier production still inhabited that place, as if Jim's sacrifice had somehow sanctified that land. The connection between the 2 men transcended the professional. Both continued working together on the Hallow app, guiding millions of faithful through meditations on the Stations of the Cross and the 7 last words of Christ. Their voices alternated, complementing each other in ways that seemed providential. Jim brought the raw intensity of someone who had literally bled for his role. Jonathan offered a welcoming softness, a warm humanity that made Jesus accessible in new ways. Together, they represented 2 faces of the same divine mystery. But the impact of the meeting between Jim and Jonathan goes far beyond their individual careers. What happened between them symbolizes something greater, a passing of the torch between generations of Christian artists. Jim Caviezel opened the way in an era when making openly religious cinema was considered professional suicide. He paid the price with his career, his health, his reputation. And now, 20 years later, he could see the fruits of his sacrifice. The Chosen exists because The Passion of the Christ proved there was a massive audience hungry for authentic faith content. Every Christian film that premieres today, every series that explores biblical themes without shame, every actor who publicly declares their faith without fear of retaliation, owes something to the man who was struck by lightning and kept standing. Jonathan understood this. And when he expressed that recognition to Jim, he wasn't just paying a polite compliment. He was acknowledging a spiritual debt that an entire generation of Christian artists carries. Jim Caviezel wasn't just an actor playing a role. He was a modern martyr, sacrificing his career on the altar of his conviction. And finally, after 2 decades of silence and ostracism, someone who truly understood the weight of that sacrifice looked into his eyes and said, "Thank you." What happens when a man who carried an invisible cross for 20 years finally receives the validation his heart secretly longed for? What happens when wounds he believed had healed are touched by words of genuine healing? And what does this mean for the future of Christian cinema now that the torch is being passed to a new generation? The answers to these questions reveal not only the depth of the transformation that occurred in Jim Caviezel, but also secrets about what really happened during the original filming that are only now coming to light. 2 decades after they were carefully hidden from the public, the secrets that emerged from the filming of The Passion of the Christ over the past 20 years paint a much more complex and disturbing picture than anyone outside that set could imagine. Technical crew members who kept silent for decades began to speak, some in discreet interviews, others in private circles that eventually leaked to the public. What they describe isn't simply the production of a film. It's something that defies categorization, something many still hesitate to name directly. The pattern of silence surrounding these experiences is perhaps as intriguing as the events themselves. Mel Gibson, gathered the crew after certain incidents and asked for discretion. He explained that what they were experiencing was sacred, not material for publicity or profit. The signs were for them, not for tabloid headlines. And remarkably, most respected that request for 2 decades. Journalists who tried to investigate the production found a wall of silence. There was no scandal being covered up, no crime, just a collective reverence for experiences that seemed to transcend the ordinary. Jonathan Roumie knew many of these stories before his meeting with Jim Caviezel. He had obsessively researched everything related to the Passion of the Christ before accepting his own role as Jesus. But hearing Jim speak personally about these experiences, seeing the emotion in his eyes as he recalled moments that had marked his soul in indelible ways, was completely different from reading second-hand accounts. Jim shared with Jonathan details he had never revealed publicly. He spoke about nights when he would wake up feeling the weight of the cross on his shoulders, even months after filming ended. He described dreams in which he relived the crucifixion with a sensory intensity that left him exhausted upon waking. He admitted that for years he had difficulty watching his own film, not out of professional vanity, but because every scene reopened emotional wounds he still hadn't learned to fully process. And then Jim said something that touched Jonathan in a particularly profound way. He confessed that for a long time he wondered if his sacrifice had been worth it. His career had been devastated. His health had been compromised. He had been labeled as an extremist, a fanatic, someone who had gone too far. And in the darkest moments, in the silent nights when doubts crept in, he questioned whether God had really asked so much of him, or if he had simply made a colossal mistake that destroyed his professional life. It was at that moment that Jonathan offered the words that broke Jim. He looked into the eyes of the man who had been literally crucified for his art, and said that every child who watches The Chosen and meets Jesus for the first time, every adult who rediscovers their faith through the series, every family that gathers to watch together and talk about spirituality afterward, all of that exists because Jim Caviezel had the courage to go first. The sacrifice wasn't in vain. The scars had meaning. The price paid had purchased something of eternal value. For a man who carried silent doubts for 20 years, hearing that validation from someone who intimately understood the weight of playing Christ was overwhelming. Jim Caviezel, the man who endured lightning and whippings without wavering, finally allowed himself to cry. And in that moment of shared vulnerability, something healed in his soul that no heart surgery could have achieved. The healing that happened in Jim Caviezel's soul at that meeting with Jonathan Roumie was just the beginning of a transformation that continues to unfold to this day. Men who carry invisible wounds for decades rarely recover instantly, but something fundamental changed in how Jim came to see his own journey. The weight of doubt he had silently carried, questioning whether his sacrifice had meant anything, was replaced by a clarity he hadn't experienced since before the filming of The Passion of the Christ. He could finally look back and see not just the pain, but the purpose woven through every moment of suffering. Jim Caviezel emerged from that meeting with a new perspective on his legacy. He had always publicly defended his faith, had always refused to apologize for his convictions. But there was a subtle difference between defending a position and celebrating a victory. For 20 years, Jim had been in defensive mode, constantly justifying his choices, explaining why he had accepted the role, responding to critics who accused him of destroying his own career through religious fanaticism. Now, for the first time, he could simply rest in the certainty that he had fulfilled his purpose. The irony wasn't lost on Jim. Hollywood had rejected him for playing Jesus, labeling him as radioactive, as someone too toxic to be associated with mainstream projects. And yet, 2 decades later, the Christian cinema he had helped legitimize was flourishing like never before. The Chosen had reached numbers that would make any studio executive salivate. Faith films were regularly appearing at the box office, some generating hundreds of millions of dollars, and all of it had started with a man willing to be struck by lightning for his conviction. Jonathan Roumie, for his part, carried the weight of that meeting in ways that shaped his own approach to the role of Jesus. He had always felt the responsibility to represent Christ with authenticity and reverence, but talking with Jim added a new dimension to that responsibility. Now he understood, viscerally, that he wasn't just playing a character. He was carrying a legacy that had been paid for with real blood, with sacrificed careers, with lives irreversibly transformed. In subsequent interviews, Jonathan began mentioning Jim with a frequency and reverence that didn't go unnoticed. When asked about the pressure of playing Jesus, he frequently cited Caviezel's example as the impossible standard he tried to honor. In one particularly moving interview, Jonathan admitted that there are moments when he feels completely inadequate for the role. Moments when the weight of expectations seems crushing. And in those moments, he thinks of Jim, of the man who literally endured everything and never backed down, and finds the strength to continue. What few realize is how this meeting affected the dynamic between the two men in the following months. Their collaborations on the Hallow app became deeper, more personal. When they recorded meditations on the Stations of the Cross, there was a different quality to their voices, an intimacy born of mutual recognition. Jim brought the raw authority of someone who had lived each station in his own body. Jonathan offered the tenderness of someone who understood that Christ's suffering wasn't just historical, but eternally present in every person who carries their own cross. But the impact of the meeting extended far beyond professional collaborations. Jim Caviezel began speaking more openly about aspects of his experience he had kept guarded for years. In talks to Catholic groups, he started sharing details he had never revealed before, not out of a desire for attention, but because he finally felt he had permission to publicly process what he had lived through. Jonathan's validation had somehow freed something that had been locked inside him. In one of these talks, Jim revealed that for years after filming, he would wake up in the middle of the night feeling the nails in his hands. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a real physical sensation, a bodily memory that his nervous system had apparently absorbed during the interminable hours nailed to that wooden cross. He learned to pray in those moments, to offer the phantom pain as a form of intercession for others who suffered. What had been a torment became a spiritual discipline. He also spoke about the cost to his marriage and family. His wife, Kerry, had been by his side through everything, but there were moments when the man who returned from those filmings in Italy wasn't the same man she had known. Jim admitted he needed years to fully reintegrate his identity, to separate who he was from who he had portrayed. The line between Jim Caviezel and Jesus Christ had blurred in ways he hadn't anticipated, and finding his way back to himself was a journey as arduous as anything he had faced on set. Jonathan Roumie immediately recognized these challenges because he himself faced them. In a deeply honest interview, Jonathan admitted that playing Jesus sets an impossible standard he could never achieve as an actor or as a human being. There's an endless journey of self-improvement when you try to represent the supreme model of humanity, and Jesus challenges us to love the people we find hardest to love. This was a daily battle, not just on camera, but in every interaction, in every decision, in every quiet moment when no one was watching. The pressure of being confused with his character weighed enormously on Jonathan. People approached him expecting divine wisdom, miraculous healing, answers to existential questions that he, as a fallible human being, simply didn't possess. He learned to gently redirect those expectations, to remind people that he wasn't the real Jesus, just someone trying to honor his story. But each of those interactions left a mark, a constant reminder of the impossible responsibility he had taken on. What Jim offered Jonathan at that meeting was equally valuable to what Jonathan had offered him. Jim shared strategies he had developed over 20 years to maintain his sanity while carrying the weight of having played Christ. He spoke about the importance of daily spiritual practices, about finding community with other believers who saw him first as a brother and then as a famous actor, about learning to accept that he would never be able to satisfy all the expectations projected onto him. And Jim offered something more: permission. Permission to be human, permission to fail, permission to have difficult days when the weight seems unbearable. Jim had learned, through much suffering, that carrying Christ's image didn't mean being perfect. It meant being authentic in his imperfection while pointing toward the one who was truly perfect. That distinction, seemingly simple, was liberating for Jonathan in ways he's still processing. The moment when Jim couldn't handle what Jonathan told him wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a moment of long-needed healing. It was the instant when 2 decades of silent doubt finally found an answer. It was the validation of a sacrifice the world had largely ignored or condemned. And it was, paradoxically, a moment of strength, because allowing yourself to be vulnerable before someone who genuinely understands is one of the bravest acts a human being can perform. The Bible teaches us, in Romans chapter 5, verse 8, that God demonstrates his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That unconditional love, that willingness to sacrifice everything for those who didn't yet deserve such sacrifice, is what both Jim and Jonathan tried to capture in their performances. And in ways that transcend art, they themselves lived versions of that surrender. Jim sacrificed his career, his health, his reputation. Jonathan daily sacrifices his privacy, his personal identity, his ability to simply exist as an ordinary man. The meeting between these 2 men wasn't just a beautiful moment between colleagues who share an unusual role. It was a turning point in the history of Christian cinema. It was the moment when the first generation passed the torch to the second, not with resentment or competition, but with blessing and mutual recognition. Jim Caviezel opened doors that Jonathan Roumie now walks through freely. And Jonathan honors that legacy not only in his performances, but in the way he treats the man who paid the price so he could exist. What does this mean for the future? What happens when the sequel to The Passion of the Christ finally reaches screens, now with a new actor in the main role? And how will Jim Caviezel and Jonathan Roumie continue to shape the landscape of Christian entertainment in the years to come? The answers to these questions are only beginning to reveal themselves, but one thing is certain. The meeting between these 2 men changed both of them permanently, and the echo of that transformation will continue to resonate for generations.